our next speaker is Richard Barham, who's a partner with Dentons. So I think Richard's going to hopefully provide a bit more legal perspective on some of those modes of entry that Benjamin has been discussing previously. Richard?
Hi, everyone. Good to meet you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'll just share my screen, if you bear with me a second. Right, hopefully my screen is up now. Thanks for that. I listened to most of Benjamin's speech, and I agree with absolutely everything he said. So that's nice and easy. So I'm a corporate partner at Dentons, so do M&A, investments, startups. I also sort of run our UK China desk, so deal quite a lot with China. Don't just deal exclusively with China, see other jurisdictions as well. So I've over the last sort of 7 or 8 years, whilst I've been doing that, I've seen a lot of investment into China and indeed investment out of China. The one thing I would say is you will need a Chinese lawyer to advise you. You'll need somebody who's actually qualified in Chinese lawyer to advise you on how you start up. I tend to do more Chinese companies coming out of London, but also have to sort of help sort of the sort of concierge clients going into China as well, but finding the right lawyer for them. And there's the second slide here is just it's my only sort of Dentons plug, really, which is about our global presence. We're the biggest law firm in the world by some margin. We have 4,500 lawyers in China, which I think there's only 2 other firms in the world which have a greater number of lawyers around the world. So 4,500 lawyers in China, and I think that adds up to 43 cities, which is important for reasons I will explain. So we know, I can't say I know lawyers in every single one of those cities, but all the cities that you're likely to be looking at going into, I can introduce you to a lawyer to help you with your establishment. So Benjamin talked about the sort of the forms of entry, and these are the ones I'm going to talk about relatively briefly. So acquisitions, joint ventures, commercial contracting or licensing, and startup. So I want to make, but first of all, I want to make a few sort of very general comments, which I think are quite important for anyone going into China. And this is sort of what I've gleaned from my experience of advising over the last 7 or 8 years on this. So,
Richard, sorry to jump in. Would you mind going full screen just so we can get a little better view?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Is that better? Is that better?
The same. Yeah, it looks the same to me. Maybe from the slideshow tab at the top of your screen.
Yeah, I seem to have the slideshow tab here, but it doesn't seem to be. It sort of works. I've got 2 screens here. It works on the one screen, which I think is the Zoom screen, but it's not really working on the other, despite the
Sure.
Despite me clicking on the presentations box. It's not really doing anything, I'm afraid.
Sure. We'll do too much, so I'll let you kick back on.
Okay. So the first question, you dealing with China, you need somebody on the ground who's really sort of your representative, your person on the ground in China, and that's not just a sort of a lawyer to help you out, or it can be a sort of a sales rep or an agent to begin with, but then you need your man or woman on the ground in China to help you. You can sort of set up rep offices, but it's sometimes difficult to recruit people because people only have rep offices for a period of time whilst they're really testing the market. You want people who are going to be there long term and be on your side. So that is important because there's quite a lot to do. For example, with the Chinese authorities, you need somebody who's going to be there doing that for you. The other thing I've experienced is you do need people who are Chinese working with you for doing work in China. And that's not just about Chinese language, it's also about Chinese culture. I mean, Chinese language, I have a number of people who work with me in London who speak Chinese but aren't Chinese nationals. And they speak Chinese, but it's much more a colloquial sort of type Chinese. It's not business Chinese, and you really need somebody who really can communicate in business Chinese. But you also need somebody who understands the culture. So I have a Chinese national who works for me, who's actually an English qualified lawyer. And there was a deal we were working on, and she sort of raised an issue when we were working on it, say there's a loss of face issue. that's going on here. None of the other English parties to it understood that at all, but it just actually helped us manage the transaction to get it over the line because we understood the issue, could manage it. The other thing about China is you will deal with Chinese authorities. You can't avoid dealing with the Chinese authorities, whether it's the Ministry of Commerce, the taxman, or any other sort of licensing body, and they play a key role in any of the sort of entry into China, which we'll hopefully explain as we go along. The other thing I'd also emphasize is that whilst there is a common law across all of China, you'll find that the various provinces in China and the special cities, the sort of the Shanghai, Shenzhen of this world, will actually interpret those laws slightly differently and apply them slightly differently. So each province has its own way of doing things. So you need somebody really who understands that province. So if you go to a lawyer in Shanghai, you might find that they're not really the person to deal with an issue in Dalian or somewhere else like that. So you do need somebody who understands that really well. And you need people who know the authorities. So there was a transaction I was doing this time last year for a company that was buying sort of a travel IT business, and it had offices in a number of places, including actually Dalian. And in that instance, there was an issue as to what the licensing requirements were for that company, whether they needed a specific kind of IT license from the authorities. And I was dealing with a partner in our local office, and they could actually, they knew the person to speak to in the relevant authority and could go and have a conversation with them. So they actually managed to do that quite quickly. If you'd gone to a lawyer in Beijing or Shanghai, that might have been a much more difficult process. So we move to the second box here. So commerciality of Chinese partners and advisors. I think you need to remember that, you know, it was only in about 1990 that China actually started to develop laws. Before then, there was no contract law. People didn't enter into contracts. So commerciality of the Chinese has been developing over the last sort of 30 years and is still developing. And that means you've got one of two issues. Either they are too commercial and just want to jump to things quite quickly, or they're actually not commercial at all and just stick to their guns, even when in normal in a normal run of a transaction, you again do a proper commercial negotiations. You have to be aware of that as well. The other thing to do is you need to really conduct a proper due diligence on your counterparties. Are they who they say they are? Scams are quite popular in China, and I've come across a few. Fortunately, none of my clients have been particularly affected by them, but I've heard of people talking about scams, and they're quite elaborate scams as well. I can remember a few years ago, a bank was discovered in one secondary city in China, and it was running itself as Goldman Sachs. It was looking like Goldman Sachs, had all the logos outside the building. It was passing itself as Goldman Sachs. It had absolutely no connection with Goldman Sachs at all. I've also had instances where on a due diligence, somebody had actually set up a scam office of a Chinese authority, so that when individuals go to that office, they are getting told exactly what the seller wants you to hear about. So you can have quite elaborate scams. So it's quite important to check who you're dealing with. So you need to sort of ask for references, you need to check them, you need to talk to others, you need to check the address, you need somebody to go around to the address, make sure it looks right. You can ask for their business license, tax registration, IP registration. They might even be prepared to give you some finance documents. You need to check them out at the Ministry of Commerce. So there's quite a lot of proper due diligence to be done on counterparties. And you also, when you're dealing with a counterparty, you need to make sure that the person you're dealing with has the authority to actually have sort of agree things with you. It's true of every jurisdiction when you're dealing with companies, but particularly so I think in relation to China, is the person you're dealing with, do they have authority to represent the counterparty? The last box is probably the more legal element of it all. So, and a lawyer's bound to say this, but you do really need to document the deal. If you are getting a deal done, if you are entering some heads of terms before you do the deal, you do need to put it out in writing to make sure you've got a common understanding of what's been agreed. And ideally, you'll have it in English and in Mandarin, so everybody understands exactly what's going on, but hopefully with English as the dominating language. But there are two other things you always need to think about in any heads of agreement or contract you're entering into. The first is the governing law of the legal documentation. That makes a difference. I've seen this happen a number of times. We've drafted up for a UK company a heads of terms with confidentiality and exclusivity provisions in it, which are binding, but everything else is non-binding, and setting out the terms of the deal. They've gone out to China to negotiate it. They've come back and said, we signed up what we said, but we've just changed the law, the governing law of it, from English law to Chinese law. So that's okay, isn't it? Well, it may not be a big issue, but there are additional obligations imposed on you by changing the law to Chinese law. So under Chinese law, you suddenly enter into an obligation of good faith in relation to the negotiations, which you wouldn't do under English law normally, unless that's specifically stated in the heads of terms. So that means that you are obliged to try to do the deal, and you can only pull out of the deal for a good reason. So there's an extra level of obligation on you in relation to that. And also, the one thing you always need to think about whenever you're entering into a contract is how would you want to enforce it? It's okay to have it under English law, but actually, if you want to enforce it against a Chinese counterparty and all their assets are in China, that may not help you. It's probably easier as a matter of course to go for arbitration and a sensible arbitration centre, maybe Singapore, maybe London, if you can get away with that. Because arbitral awards are enforceable under the New York Convention of 1958 in China. It may not be the easiest thing to do, but it's much easier than getting a UK court judgment, which is much more difficult to enforce in China. So you need to think about all of that. But overall, you just need to be agile. You need to be flexible in how you operate. So I think we've got about another 5 minutes left. So we'll go on to talk just briefly about acquisitions, joint ventures and startups. So the first thing you always need to know is which industry sector are you dealing with if you're actually sort of going into China under any of these forms. And in China, they have sort of 3 lists: the prohibited, restricted and encouraged lists. And these set out various industries under them. So if it's prohibited, so for example, sort of security type things, they clearly can't have foreign investment in those areas. If it's restricted, and there's about 30 areas that are restricted, then you need approval for doing that, and it may be quite difficult to get those approvals. So it's things like mining or manufacturing, or I think that there is some relevance to the people listening today. There is some scientific research which is on that as well, so you need to check whether you're in that restricted list. But actually, I expect for most people today, you're likely to be more on the encouraged list. So the encouraged list are areas where they definitely do want foreign investment. All these lists change on a yearly basis. The 2002 list for encouraged had 1,474 items on it. So an awful long list. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are healthcare sector sort of subsets of industry on it. There's also elderly care as well. So on the healthcare sector, I'm just going to read out a few of them. There's therapeutic, medical and health textiles, hernia repair materials, drugs for rare diseases, dental implants. There's a number of other things. So if you are thinking about going into China, you should get yourself checked against that list and see where you are, and hopefully you're on the encouraged sector section of it. Then, as Benjamin said, you need to work out your budget. It takes a lot longer and costs more to set up in China. You do need to think about who's your person on the ground. So you're probably going to have an employee. You've got to have a registered office, and you've got to have a lease for a year. So you've got to pay for that. You've got to have a bank account. You've got to have an auditor. So all those things need to be thought about and properly budgeted. You also need to think about what type of entity you're going to set up. There are various entities that you can set up, included wholly foreign-owned enterprises, foreign invested commercial enterprises, joint ventures and foreign invested partnerships. So you need to understand and need advice from Chinese lawyers to which one of those you would set up. And that which one you set up would depend on ownership and the business scope. So what is the business of that entity? You also need to be aware that you need to register with the Ministry of Commerce exactly what the business is going to do. There's a drop-down list of over 1,000 different types of business, and you need to put down not just what the business is going to do now, but also what you think the business is going to do in the future. If you go outside that, you might be investigated by the ministry, which is probably not a good thing to do. So you need to think right at the beginning, what is the maximum scope of the business activity? You also need to think about the investment structure, and this is always comes down to tax and sort of how you get money back out of China. You might think about setting up an offshore entity, benefiting from double tax treaties. Quite common to do so, but the Chinese authorities will want to know that structure and sort of be okay with it. Otherwise, you might find you're going to lose some of the tax benefits of that in China. As with any joint venture, you need to think about control and veto rights. Who has the power within the company? Who makes decisions? If you're the minority shareholder, on what areas do you want to have a decision casting vote to basically block a decision or make sure it goes ahead? And as with any of these types of investment, how do you get out? What's the consequences? If the worst happens, what do you need to do? And that needs to be documented as well. So in my last minute or two, I'm just going to talk about commercial contracts and licensing, which is the last of the 4 types of investment I was talking about. And this is obviously sort of slightly lighter because you're not setting up an entity, but what's your level of commitment to all of this? Do you still need somebody on the ground to represent you? Again, you've got issues on payments and tax, and how does money come out with you paying the least amount of tax? IP, as you will know from your own business, I'm sure you've got to think about who owns the IP, who's licensing it to who, and what are the terms of that license, and does that fall away on termination? So you need to think about the termination rights and the consequences, and IP ownership on all of that. So I think that's all I was going to say. I think my 15 minutes are up, but I don't know if I've got time for 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Richard. Really interesting and technical, detailed presentation. I think encouraging to hear that, even though there are challenges, there are mechanisms in place for some actual contractual enforcement. So nice to hear. I think time for one question. Is it better to have English contracts? Can you have English contracts, or should you stick with Chinese language agreements, or both?
I think I'm not just saying this as an English lawyer, but if you can have English contracts, it's better to have English contracts because you'll know where you are, and around the world, the English courts and English arbitral bodies are well respected. So English law is well respected, and quite often a lot of the work I do is English law contracts in jurisdictions outside the UK with no UK nexus at all. So that is fairly common. The Chinese counterparty may not be comfortable with that. So, and if you're doing stuff in China, there's a bit of an argument about whether it being Chinese law. There are some bits you probably do need to have Chinese law for. If there are things on the ground, you're sort of doing sub-licensing within China, for example, of IP, things like that, or sort of dealing with suppliers to any entity you set up, you're going to probably do that under Chinese law. But you might think about a neutral law. I mean, 10 years ago, we'd all go to Hong Kong for doing it. That sort of seems to have fallen away. But Singapore is obviously a good law to go to if you need to have a neutral law. I've also seen Dubai being used as well for going into China. So there are some options, but it's one of the things you actually need to think of first, because actually you need the right lawyer to advise on it. So sometimes you find that people do it at the last minute and say, actually, I know we've been negotiating under English law or Chinese law, but we want it to be under Singaporean law now. So it's a bit of a pain because you sort of got to start from scratch again.
Sure. Well, nice to know that there's at least some flexibility and kind of maneuvering through there. So great stuff. Really appreciate you sharing with us.
Okay, no problem. Good to speak to you all.